Jacob Barnes never imagined that a single act of defiance could change the course of his life and the fate of an entire planet. Earth, under the heel of the Zorath Empire, had become a shadow of what it once was. Its cities were little more than industrial hubs where humanity served as little more than cogs in a vast galactic machine. Every human was tracked, controlled, and reduced to labor for the Empire's insatiable needs. There was no room for rebellion, no hope of escape. The Zorath had ensured it. Jacob worked in a factory that manufactured weapons for the Zorath, the iron walls of his workplace pressing in on him as he spent long hours assembling the tools of oppression. Every day felt the same. Every day, the Zorath's enforcers would patrol the facility, making sure that the workers didn't even think of escaping. But the truth was, Jacob had grown tired of the silence of a world that had long forgotten its own strength. One evening, a young woman named Mara was brought in, her face bruised, her eyes empty of hope. The Zorath guards had caught her trying to escape, and now they were bringing her in for punishment. Her crime? Simply wanting freedom. Jacob couldn't stand the thought of what was to come. The Zorath would break her, body and spirit, and she would never see the light of day again. It was a moment of instinct. Jacob couldn't say why he acted, only that he did. As the guards dragged Mara towards the detention cells, he stepped forward, grabbed a discarded wrench, and struck one of the Zorath enforcers in the back. The blow was clumsy, but it was enough to disrupt the guards long enough for Mara to escape. For a brief moment, their eyes met, Mara's filled with both disbelief and gratitude. Then, chaos erupted. The Zorath guards turned, their eyes glowing with fury, their minds immediately locking onto Jacob. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran, pushing past stunned factory workers who hadn't dared to move. But the Zorath were faster. They could read his every thought, anticipate his next move before he made it. A blur of energy rushed through the air, and suddenly Jacob felt as though an invisible hand had grabbed hold of him, slamming him against the cold factory wall. Everything went black for a moment. When Jacob came to, the factory floor was a blur of shouting Zorath soldiers. His body ached, and his vision was doubled. But there was something else, a feeling he couldn't describe. It started in his chest, a deep primal thrum that grew stronger with each passing moment. His hands clenched involuntarily. His fingers pulsed with a strange energy, and the air around him seemed to distort as if reacting to his rage. A psychic wave, born of nothing but pure, raw emotion, shot outward like a tidal wave. The guards staggered backward, their weapons dropping to the ground as the sheer force of Jacob's outburst sent them tumbling. In that instant, Jacob understood. He wasn't just another human. He was something more, something that the Zorath had never expected. His breathing was heavy, and the world around him seemed to still. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. This was the beginning. As the Zorath regrouped and raised their weapons, Jacob's mind raced. He had no idea what had just happened or how he had done it. But one thing was certain, he couldn't stay here. If he did, he would be killed. Or worse, tortured, like so many others. But there was a new energy burning within him now, a spark of rebellion. In the chaos, Mara appeared again, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward a hidden doorway in the back of the factory. "Come on," she whispered, urgency in her voice. "We've got to move. You don't know what you've just done, but I do. And the Zorath won't let you get away with it." Jacob hesitated for only a moment before following her through the door. This wasn't the world he had known. The world of silence and oppression was over. He wasn't just a factory worker anymore. He was the spark of something far larger, and he would never let the Zorath keep him in chains again. Jacob had no idea what kind of storm he had unleashed. As he stumbled through the dark alleyways with Mara, his heart still racing from the encounter, his mind was clouded with 1,000 questions. What had just happened to him? How had he generated that power? And why did it feel so natural? They reached a hidden underground compound, a safe house for the human resistance, Ironed On. It was tucked away beneath the ruins of an old city, its location known only to a select few. Inside, a handful of survivors and rebels huddled around flickering holoscreens, poring over maps and intelligence reports. The place was a far cry from the sterile, controlled world Jacob had known in the factory. Here, humanity's fight for survival was alive and real, but it was clear that the odds were still overwhelmingly against them. Mara led Jacob into a small, dimly lit room where Dr. Elena Holt waited. She was an unlikely leader, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, and carrying the weight of years spent researching humanity's hidden potential. Elena had long suspected that humans were not the weak, inferior species the Zorath believed them to be. For decades, she had pored over ancient texts and genetic studies, searching for evidence of a latent power buried deep within humanity's DNA. And now, it seemed her theories were no longer just speculative. "Elena, this is Jacob Barnes," Mara introduced. "He's the one we've been waiting for." Jacob couldn't speak. The scientist's eyes were immediately drawn to the telltale signs of his awakening. His rapid breathing, the barely suppressed energy pulsing beneath his skin. She stepped forward, her gaze intent. "You've manifested," she said softly, almost to herself. "You're not the first, but you're certainly the most powerful." "Manifested?" Jacob asked, his voice still shaky from the adrenaline. "What the hell's happening to me? What is this?" "Elena," Mara said, her voice tense, "we need to get him out of here. The Zorath will be looking for him. They've never seen anything like this before." Elena shook her head. "No, we need to understand it. We need to know what Jacob can do before they come for him. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." She turned to Jacob, her eyes softening. "What you just did, that was no accident. You're part of something much bigger than yourself. Humanity has always had a hidden potential for psychic powers. We've been blind to it, but it's there. Now, it's waking up." Jacob felt a pang of confusion. Psychic powers. He had never felt anything like this before today. It was as if a door had been opened inside him, one that led to a universe of untapped energy. It was overwhelming and terrifying, but at the same time, it felt like freedom. "What do you mean by psychic powers? How is this possible?" Jacob demanded. "Elena's right," Mara interjected, her voice filled with urgency. "You're not the only one. There are others who have started to awaken, but we haven't had time to fully train them. And we haven't had time to prepare for what the Zorath will do once they figure out what's happening." Jacob clenched his fists, the power inside him swirling like a storm. His mind burned with possibilities. He could feel the weight of it, the energy begging to be used. But he wasn't sure how. "What can I do with this? Can we fight them?" "That's what we need to figure out," Elena replied. "We've been testing theories for years. Humans have always been capable of more than we know. The Zorath, they've known this for centuries. That's why they've worked so hard to suppress us. But now you've triggered something inside yourself, a power that could change everything." The weight of Elena's words hit Jacob like a hammer. A power that could change everything. He wasn't just a worker in a factory anymore. He wasn't just an ordinary man. He was part of something much larger, something that could challenge the Zorath's dominance over the galaxy. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud alarm blaring through the compound. "They're here," Mara hissed. "We need to move now." Panic surged through Jacob, but Elena placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry," she said, her voice steady. "This is what we've been preparing for. You don't have to fight alone. The Iron Dawn is here. You're one of us now." Before Jacob could respond, the door to the room burst open. A group of Iron Dawn rebels stormed in, their eyes filled with determination and readiness. Among them was a tall man, his face scared but resolute. "We need to move now. The Zorath know about the breakout at the factory. They're hunting anyone who is awake." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. Awake. He was just beginning to understand the gravity of what had happened to him. The rebellion wasn't just about survival, it was about fighting back. But they couldn't win without understanding the forces that had awoken inside him. The rebels quickly ushered Jacob and Elena to a hidden exit. As they made their way through the winding tunnels beneath the city, Jacob could feel it, the invisible pull of something greater. Something calling to him, urging him to break free. The fight had begun. And this time, the Zoreth wouldn't be able to control humanity any longer. Not when Jacob, and so many others like him, were finally ready to fight. The next few weeks were a blur of training, strategy, and discovery. Jacob had barely grasped the extent of his powers when Elena and the Iron Dawn resistance moved him into a secluded training facility deep in the mountains, far from the watchful eyes of the Zoreth. The underground compound was a haven of sorts, a place where humans, newly awakened to their latent psychic abilities, could learn to control their powers before the Zoreth came for them. Jacob, still reeling from the chaotic events that had led him here, spent the days trying to understand what had happened to him. At first, his abilities seemed uncontrollable, moments of raw, untamed power that caused destruction in every direction. But slowly, Elena and the other trainers helped him refine his focus. Through hours of meditative exercises, he learned to center his mind, harnessing the raw energy surging through him. The breakthrough came one night when, after a particularly frustrating training session, Jacob found himself alone in a quiet corner of the compound. His thoughts were scattered, his frustration bubbling over. It was then that something unexpected happened. His powers came to him not as a violent outburst, but as a precise, controlled wave of energy. The air around him shimmered with an electric hum as he stretched out his mind, gently manipulating the objects in front of him. For the first time, Jacob understood. He wasn't just a vessel of power. He was a conduit, capable of shaping the universe around him. Good, Elena's voice cut through his concentration, startling him. She had been watching from the shadows, a proud smile on her face. You're learning. It's not about the force of the power. It's about control. Jacob let out a slow breath, feeling the power settle back within him. I'm not sure I understand, he admitted. All I've been doing is focusing, and trying not to break everything in my path. Elena stepped forward, her eyes glowing with the intensity of her belief. You don't just have power, Jacob. You have the ability to connect with the very fabric of the universe, to manipulate energy, to shape the laws of physics in ways we never thought possible. We've been blind to it for centuries. The Zoreth, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. They knew humans had this potential. That's why they've suppressed us. They wanted to keep us weak. But now, it's time for us to show them what we're capable of. Jacob turned toward the massive training room, now buzzing with activity as other humans, each with their own powers, practiced. Some could create shields of psychic force, others could manipulate metal, and a few could even influence the thoughts of others. The Iron Dawn was growing stronger by the day. But as Jacob trained, an uncomfortable truth gnawed at him. His powers were far stronger than anything they had seen before. He wasn't just another soldier in a rebellion. He was becoming something else, a leader. But was he ready for that? Was he ready to wield this power responsibly? Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the pull of something greater, something more dangerous. What if he lost control? What if he became the very thing the Zoreth feared, an unstoppable force? His doubts were interrupted when a figure stepped into the room, a woman with striking red hair and a hardened gaze. She introduced herself as Seraph, the leader of the Iron Dawn's elite tactical team. We've got a mission, she said curtly. The Zoreth are making their move. They've deployed a battalion to search for us. We need to hit them hard before they hit us. Jacob nodded, his pulse quickening. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for. His training had prepared him for this, or so he hoped. But it wasn't just about the fight. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity was no longer the oppressed. They would no longer bow to the Zoreth. Seraph led them through the strategic plans as Elena briefed Jacob on their most recent intelligence. The Zoreth had begun deploying experimental, heavily armored war machines, powerful enough to wipe out entire resistance cells in a single sweep. The Resistance's first target would be a Zoreth supply depot on a remote moon, where they could strike a decisive blow. Jacob's heart pounded. A part of him felt exhilarated at the thought of finally fighting back, but another part was filled with dread. What if his powers weren't enough? What if he couldn't control them in the heat of battle? The night before the operation, Jacob found himself standing alone on a cliff overlooking the compound, the stars scattered across the sky above him. The universe felt vast, endless, and somehow indifferent. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. He felt like he belonged here, like he had a purpose. As he stood there, Elena approached, her footsteps quiet on the rocky ground. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, looking out at the stars. "You're ready," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "You've always been ready." Jacob didn't reply at first. Instead, he turned toward her, his face grim. "I'm not sure. I have the power, but what if I lose control? What if I destroy everything?" Elena smiled, her expression full of quiet confidence. "The power isn't the problem, Jacob. It's how you use it. And I believe in you. Humanity believes in you. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to fight. For all of us." The words settled in Jacob's chest like a weight, but also a fire. Tomorrow, they would face the Zoreth, and for the first time in centuries, humanity would rise. He wasn't just a pawn in their game anymore. He was a force of nature, and nothing would stop him from breaking their chains. The mission had gone perfectly. At first, the Iron Dawn had successfully infiltrated the Zoreth supply depot on the remote moon, a vital hub of the Empire's war machine. Jacob, now fully in command of his powers, had led the charge with a fierce determination. The battle had been swift. The Zoreth soldiers were overpowered, their advanced technology rendered useless against the human resistance's unexpected psychic assault. The depot, a sprawling complex of high-tech structures and energy grids, had been disabled, cutting off vital resources for the Zoreth's frontline forces. But as they made their escape, the tide of success quickly turned. Just as the last of the resistance fighters began retreating into the shadows, a fleet of Zoreth warships emerged from the planet's atmosphere. They had been waiting, lying in wait for the rebels to strike. The Zoreth knew the Iron Dawn had the power to cripple their operations, but they also knew the resistance wouldn't be able to evade the full force of the Empire's wrath. Jacob's heart sank. They had been set up. "Get to the extraction point." Seraph barked, her voice taut with urgency. "Move, now." The human forces scattered, retreating in different directions. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. He could sense the Zoreth's presence closing in. Psychically, he felt their cold, calculating minds probing his own. It was clear they had anticipated the assault, and now the resistance was trapped. As they neared the extraction point, Jacob's eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. A group of Zoreth soldiers had cornered General Marcus Kane, one of the Iron Dawn's most trusted leaders. Kane was surrounded, and yet he wasn't fighting back. The truth hit Jacob like a slap in the face. Kane wasn't a prisoner. He was part of the trap. "Elena," Jacob shouted, his voice hoarse with realization. "Kane's a traitor. He's working with the Zoreth." Elena's eyes widened in horror. "What? No, that can't be." But it was too late. As if in response to Jacob's shout, Kane turned, his eyes cold and empty of the warmth he once had. He was no longer the man they had trusted. The Zoreth had him, body and soul. A psychic wave, dark and oppressive, surged from Kane, pushing the rebels back as if they were mere ragdolls. Jacob gritted his teeth, resisting the pull of the traitor's mind. But it was like fighting against a storm. Kane had been trained by the Zoreth, his own powers augmented over years of manipulation. He had become a weapon, a sleeper agent embedded deep within the Iron Dawn. "Jacob, fall back." Elena shouted as she pulled him to his feet, her voice strained with both fear and determination. "We can't fight him here. We need to get to the shuttle." But the betrayal didn't stop with Kane. Jacob's mind, still reeling from the shock, began to piece together the horrifying truth. The Zoreth had been infiltrating the resistance from the inside for months. Kane wasn't the only one working with the enemy. There were others, people Jacob had trusted, who were secretly working to undermine everything they had fought for. "Move, now," Seraph ordered, her voice sharp and commanding as the rebels regrouped and fought their way toward the extraction zone. But Jacob's heart was heavy with doubt. The Iron Dawn had been their hope, their symbol of defiance. Now, the very foundation of their rebellion was crumbling. The resistance wasn't just fighting an external enemy anymore. They were battling the insidious rot from within. As they reached the extraction point, Jacob took one last look at the burning wreckage of the Zoreth depot, the flames casting an eerie glow across the desolate landscape. The victory that had seemed so promising was slipping through their fingers. And worse, Jacob could feel the weight of the treachery gnawing at him. The Zoreth had been right about one thing. Humanity had power, but power alone wasn't enough to defeat an enemy that knew how to manipulate and corrupt. "Is this how it ends?" Jacob whispered to himself, the question hanging in the air. But Elena was by his side, her face set with grim resolve. "No," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "This is just the beginning. We will rise from this. The Zoreth won't win. Not while we're still standing." Jacob met her gaze, her determination a flicker of light in the darkness. He wasn't sure how they would survive the coming storm, but one thing was certain: he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. With a last, lingering glance at the moon's charred surface, Jacob boarded the shuttle. The next battle would be even harder than this one, but humanity was no longer the oppressed. They had tasted power, and they wouldn't stop until the Zoreth's chains were broken forever. The true fight had only just begun. The shuttle's engines hummed softly, cutting through the silence that had fallen over the Iron Dawn rebels as they made their way to a hidden base on the outskirts of the planet's surface. Jacob sat in the rear of the shuttle, his fingers clenched tightly around the armrests. His mind was a whirlpool of emotions: betrayal, confusion, anger, and a deep, gnawing guilt. The victory they had fought so hard for had been turned into a trap, and it felt like the walls of their rebellion were closing in. General Kane's betrayal haunted him. Jacob couldn't shake the image of Kane's cold, empty eyes, the way he had stood, unmoving, as the Zoreth soldiers closed in. That betrayal was more than just personal. It was an indictment of everything they had worked for. If they couldn't trust their own leaders, what did they have left? How could they possibly stand against the might of the Zoreth Empire? "Elena," Jacob said, his voice low, as he turned to face the woman who had once been his rock. "How could we have missed this? Kane. He was one of us. How did we not see it?" Elena's expression was tight, her brow furrowed with the same burden of unanswered questions. "It's not your fault, Jacob. We were careful. We vetted everyone. But the Zoreth are cunning. They've been planting their agents for years, slipping under the radar. Kane wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. We're not just fighting the Zoreth. We're fighting the rot that runs through our own ranks." Jacob nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Their rebellion was fractured. The Zoreth had dealt them a devastating blow, and now there was a hole in the very heart of their organization. It wasn't just about their survival anymore. It was about the survival of what they stood for. The dream of a free humanity, of breaking the chains the Zoreth had forged, was becoming a distant hope, a fragile thing that might crumble if they didn't act quickly. Seraph entered the cabin, her face hardened with resolve. "We've regrouped," she said, "but we're not out of the fire yet. Kane's betrayal is only the beginning. The Zoreth are moving faster now, and they know who we are. They're targeting our safe houses, our supply lines. If we don't make our next move count, we'll be finished." Jacob straightened, his mind snapping into focus. The rebels were disoriented, Yes, but they were far from defeated. Iron Dawn still had its people. They had their fight, their fire. They still had a chance. But Jacob knew they needed more than just survival. They needed to strike back, hard. What if we take the fight to them? Jacob asked, his voice steady, a spark of determination igniting in his chest. We've been on the defensive for too long. The Zorath think they've beaten us, but they haven't seen everything we're capable of. We have power, and they don't know the first thing about how to deal with it. What if we show them what happens when humanity fights back? Seraph looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, but also with a flicker of hope. You're talking about hitting them where it hurts, but we can't just walk into their strongholds. We need precise intel, strategic strikes. You think you're ready for that kind of responsibility? I'm not asking to lead, Jacob said quickly, but I'm not going to sit back and let everything we fought for fall apart. We need to go on the offensive, and I think I can help us do that. Alina stepped forward, her gaze thoughtful. You're right, Jacob. It's time for us to show the Zorath that they've underestimated us. We need to send a message, a blow so significant they'll know we're not going down without a fight. The decision was made. The rebels would go on the offensive, but it wouldn't be a random attack. This would be a carefully calculated series of strikes designed to cripple the Zorath's infrastructure. They would hit supply lines, destroy key communication hubs, and sabotage their war machines. Every move would be calculated. Every strike would be precise. Jacob, despite his reservations, knew that he had a unique role to play in all of this. The power within him, the psychic force that had so terrified him, was also the key to their victory. His mind could tear through the Zorath's defenses like paper, disrupt their communications, or even disable their machines. But every time he used his powers, he felt the burden of their consequences. What if he overextended himself? What if he lost control again? Alina, Jacob said as they made their preparations for the first strike, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know if I can control it. I'm afraid of what I might become. Alina's eyes softened. You don't have to do this alone, Jacob. We're a team. And we're in this together. As the rebels prepped their weapons, gathered intel, and geared up for the next phase of the fight, Jacob found himself staring out at the distant stars once again. This was his moment. He could feel the weight of destiny upon him, the weight of humanity's future. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something else, a spark of hope. He wasn't alone. And no matter how dark the path ahead seemed, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when so many were depending on him. The Zorath had made their mistake. They had underestimated humanity's strength, and now the rebellion was ready to remind them why they had feared humanity in the first place. The war was far from over, but humanity would rise. And this time, they would not be broken. The hours leading up to the first strike felt like a lifetime. Jacob sat alone in a small corner of the rebel base, his mind swirling with plans, doubts, and the ever-looming question of whether he was ready to unleash the full extent of his abilities. His powers, once chaotic and uncontrollable, had now become his greatest weapon. But every time he focused his mind, he felt a deep, unsettling pull, like a rift inside him, a storm waiting to break free. Would he be able to control it when the time came? Or would the storm consume him? Alina, Jacob said, standing up and walking toward the leader, who was preparing the team for their mission. What if I can't do this? What if the power is too much for me? What if I destroy everything we're trying to protect? Alina looked at him, her expression unwavering. She was the heart of Iron Dawn, the symbol of hope for all of them. Jacob, you've already proven you can control it. The key isn't about perfection. It's about intention. You want to protect us. You want to help us win. That's what matters. Jacob nodded, though the weight of her words did little to soothe his fears. The Zorath were ruthless, and the rebellion had already taken a heavy blow. If they failed now, there would be no second chance. With a deep breath, he joined Alina and the others in the main war room. Seraph was at the table, outlining the first target, an industrial refinery located on a barren moon that supplied the Zorath with critical resources for their war machines. If they could destroy it, they'd cripple the Empire's ability to maintain their foothold on several key systems. The Zorath have already deployed heavy patrols around the refinery, Seraph explained. But they won't expect us to strike from the shadows. We'll need to infiltrate, disable their defenses, and detonate the core reactors. It's a high-risk mission, but it's our best chance. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. They were going to infiltrate the Zorath's heart and destroy it. For all the confidence in the room, the mission felt impossibly dangerous. They were walking into the jaws of the Empire, and failure meant certain death. "Elena," Jacob said, his voice low, "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes. But I'll need your guidance." Elena's eyes softened. "You don't need to do it alone, Jacob. We're with you. We've trained for this. And this time, we're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting for our future." As they prepared for the mission, the rebels gathered their gear, slipping into their black tactical suits, each person ready for what lay ahead. Jacob's fingers twitched with anticipation, his mind already reaching out toward the target. The Zorath's power grids, their patrols, their automated defenses, they were all there, woven together by an invisible web. Jacob's role was clear: to cripple the Zorath's communication systems, disrupt their forces, and guide the team through the compound. His powers, while growing stronger, still held an element of unpredictability. But now, he could feel the power coursing through him more consciously. He was no longer afraid. They loaded into the transport shuttles, their engines thrumming with the promise of what was to come. The moon loomed large in the distance as they broke atmosphere, heading toward the heavily fortified refinery. Jacob's thoughts sharpened, his senses extending outward. He could feel the Zorath soldiers moving in disciplined formations, their minds cold and calculating. "We're almost there," Seraph said, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "Remember, stay focused. This is our chance to hit them hard." The shuttle touched down softly in the shadows of the refinery. The team disembarked quickly, moving with precision through the terrain. They moved through a series of narrow valleys and craggy rocks that would lead them to the refinery's entrance. Jacob kept his mind alert, reaching out with his psychic abilities, sensing the presence of the enemy ahead. His awareness expanded, covering the entire compound. The Zorath were everywhere, their cold minds like black holes in the vastness of space. "Jacob," Elena whispered over the comms. "You're up." With a deep breath, Jacob stepped forward, his mind focused like a laser beam, reaching out to the complex energy grids that powered the refinery. He could feel the pulse of electricity, the rhythm of the Zorath's systems, and with a push of will, he reached into that web of power, pulling at its threads. The first wave of chaos hit. The lights flickered. Alarm bells blared across the refinery as the communication systems went down. Zorath soldiers scrambled, their coordination faltering as Jacob's minds swept through their neural networks, disrupting their connections, cutting off their coordination. Panic spread through their ranks. He could feel their anger, their confusion, as they tried to reestablish control, but Jacob held firm, pushing deeper. The power in him was raw, violent, and yet controlled. He felt like a conductor guiding a symphony of destruction. "Elena," Jacob said, his voice steady now. "The way is clear. We have a window." Seraph gave a curt nod. "Move, now." The rebels rushed forward, slipping through the now disrupted security systems, planting explosives on the core reactors. The ground shook with the intensity of their actions, and Jacob could feel the energy building, a tidal wave that would soon crash down on the Zorath's hold on this system. But even as they moved toward victory, Jacob knew this was just the beginning. They had struck the first blow, but the Zorath would retaliate with even greater force. He could already feel the storm coming. The fight for humanity's freedom had only just begun. The stars stretched out in front of the shuttle's viewport, their endless expanse a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within Jacob's chest. The rebel base was just a few hours away, but to Jacob, it felt like a lifetime. The echoes of the battle on the moon still rang in his ears. The screams of the fallen, the deafening blasts of energy weapons, and the overwhelming rush of power as he pushed his abilities to their limits. They had won the battle, yes, but it had come at a cost. The Zorath had retaliated with ferocity, and it was clear they were no longer willing to tolerate even the smallest resistance. The Iron Dawn had delivered a blow, but now the Zorath would unleash their full wrath. Jacob could feel it, like an invisible storm gathering on the horizon. "Elena," Jacob said, his voice low, breaking the silence that had settled over the shuttle. She was sitting in the pilot's seat, eyes fixed on the controls, her expression tight with concentration. But the fatigue was visible in her shoulders, the weight of their losses pressing heavily on her. "What is it, Jacob?" she asked, her tone weary but alert. "Do you think we've gone too far?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. "We fought so hard for freedom, but at what cost? We've made enemies of everyone, of the Zorath, of the systems we've damaged. What if we've pushed humanity too far too fast?" Elena was silent for a long moment, her fingers lightly tapping the controls as the shuttle hummed through space. Finally, she turned her head, her eyes meeting Jacob's. "No," she said firmly, "we haven't gone too far. We've given humanity a chance to live again, to fight again. But the cost of war is high, Jacob. We all knew that going in. We can't stop now, not after everything we've sacrificed." Jacob nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had felt the toll of their actions on his body and soul. Each strike, each battle, each life lost had left a scar on him. But Elena was right. The Zorath Empire would not rest until every human was crushed beneath their boot heel. If they were to stand a chance, they couldn't hesitate. "We've crossed a line," Jacob said quietly, his gaze returning to the stars outside. "But there's no turning back now." Elena didn't answer. Instead, she shifted in her seat, her hands moving instinctively over the controls as the shuttle entered the atmosphere of the hidden rebel base. The lights of the base flickered to life as they descended, a symbol of hope and defiance against the dark forces that sought to extinguish them. Inside the base, the rebels were already waiting. Some were celebrating their small victory, but most were somber, their faces drawn and tired. The reality of the war they were in had settled in. There was no glory in it, only struggle, sacrifice, and a constant fight to survive. Seraph was among them, standing at the head of a large table covered in maps and tactical data. When she saw Jacob and Elena enter, she gave them a grim nod. "We've got trouble," she said without preamble. "The Zorath are moving faster than we expected. They've launched a full-scale counteroffensive. We've received reports of large-scale deployments to several systems we've been targeting." Jacob's stomach tightened. The Zorath weren't just sending forces. They were launching a war to erase the rebellion. The Iron Dawn was now a priority target. But even knowing this, there was no trace of fear in Seraph's eyes. It was all determination. "We've lost several safe houses already," Seraph continued, "and their fleets are closing in on our position here. We don't have much time." "We'll fight," Jacob said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We don't stop. Not now. We've taken the first step. The Zorath might think they've crushed us, but they haven't seen everything we can do." Elena placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, offering him a silent gesture of support. Despite the overwhelming odds, he could feel a renewed fire inside him. This wasn't the time to retreat. It was time to push harder. "We'll need to regroup, reinforce our positions, and take the fight to them before they can fully mobilize," Seraph said, glancing at the tactical map. "We've already begun organizing small cells, but we need everyone to stay sharp. The Zorath are relentless, and they won't stop until we're wiped out." Jacob's mind buzzed, running through options, strategies, and possible moves. But his thoughts kept returning to the same question. How far could they push before they broke? The power within him was both a gift and a curse, and he was beginning to wonder how long he could keep it in check. If he pushed too far, would he lose himself to the storm? "We'll need to act fast," Alina said, breaking him out of his thoughts. "We can't afford to wait." Jacob met her gaze, feeling a deep sense of responsibility weighing on him. He wasn't just leading the Iron Dawn. He was leading humanity's last hope, and they couldn't afford to fail. The rebels gathered around the table, forming a plan of action. Each one knew what was at stake. Humanity's survival was no longer just a distant dream. It was a reality they had to fight for, tooth and nail. As the meeting continued, Jacob felt the burden of their mission more acutely than ever before. The stakes had escalated, and the line between victory and annihilation was razor thin. The Zoreth would come at them with everything they had, but they had no choice but to fight. He could hear the hum of the shuttle's engines, feel the pulse of the Iron Dawn, their hope, their rebellion, surging through his veins. This was it. The war for humanity's future wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about the strength to forge a new future from the ashes of the old. And no matter what it cost him, Jacob would see it through. The explosion reverberated through the barren moon, sending shockwaves into the very bones of the Zoreth refinery. The core reactors went critical in a burst of light and fire, tearing apart everything in its wake. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jacob felt the raw, overwhelming force of his power, the culmination of everything they had fought for, and it felt like victory. The Zoreth, for the first time in a long while, were reeling. But victory was fleeting. The Iron Dawn fighters made their retreat, their mission accomplished. But as Jacob and the others gathered in the shadows, adrenaline coursing through their veins, something felt off. The Zoreth had to have anticipated their strike. They had been too quiet in the aftermath. Too still. "Alina," Jacob whispered, a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. This wasn't just a blow to their refinery. We've triggered something else. The Zoreth are reacting too fast. Alina's eyes were hard, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "I know. We can't relax yet. We need to move fast. The Zoreth will retaliate, and this time, they'll come at us with everything they have." It was as if on cue. The sky above them began to light up with fire. Zoreth warships dropped from orbit, their massive forms casting shadows over the desolate surface of the moon. Their sleek black ships deployed swarms of smaller craft, each one a deadly harbinger of destruction. The rebels had hoped for a clean getaway, but the Zoreth were relentless. They had seen the full scale of the rebellion's defiance, and they would crush it with brutal efficiency. The war had shifted into a higher gear, one where humanity would no longer be allowed to play in the shadows. The shuttle, their only means of escape, sat a few hundred meters away, but the path to it was now blocked by a line of Zoreth forces, elite soldiers, well-equipped and ready for blood. Jacob's heart pounded. He could feel the Zoreth mines closing in, their presence thick and oppressive. The Iron Dawn was caught in a trap. "We fight," Seraph said, her voice cold, giving the command without hesitation. "We hold them off long enough for everyone to get to the shuttle. No one gets left behind." Jacob's mind raced as he tapped into the power within him. His hands crackled with raw energy, his senses sharpening to an almost unbearable degree. Every heartbeat felt amplified, and his thoughts were a blur of strategy, survival, and rage. This was no longer just about survival. It was about striking back with everything they had left. The Zoreth advanced, and the battle began in earnest. Energy blasts lit up the battlefield, ripping into the craggy surface of the moon, turning dust into a storm of debris. The rebels fought fiercely, their wills hardened by everything they had lost. They were no longer just defending. They were fighting for the future of humanity. Jacob focused his mind, sending pulses of psychic energy into the Zoreth ranks, disrupting their advanced technology, knocking soldiers off their feet, and disorienting their combat units. He could feel the strain of it, the wear on his body as he pushed further into his abilities. But he couldn't stop. Not now. "Belina, move," Jacob shouted as another wave of Zorath soldiers advanced. "I'll hold them back. Go." "No," she said, her voice steel. "We fight together. We get everyone out, or no one gets out." She wasn't wrong. There was no leaving anyone behind. The Iron Dawn was more than just a rebellion. It was a family, a force that had come together against impossible odds. If they were to survive, they would have to rely on each other, not just their individual powers. The shuttle was just within reach, but the Zorath pressed in, surrounding them. Their ships above unleashed volleys of fire, sending the surface of the moon into chaos. The odds were tightening, and the rebels were fighting with everything they had. Jacob gritted his teeth, his psychic power exploding in a surge of pure will. The Zorath soldiers faltered, but there were too many. He could feel his energy waning, his body screaming for rest, but there was no time for weakness, not when humanity's survival hung in the balance. And then, just as it seemed the tide would swallow them whole, a new wave of rebels emerged, fresh fighters from a nearby resistance cell. The reinforcements cut through the Zorath lines, pushing back the enemy long enough for the Iron Dawn team to reach the shuttle. With a final, desperate push, they boarded the transport and launched into the sky. The moon, once a symbol of their victory, now burned with the fires of war behind them. As they broke through the atmosphere, Jacob collapsed into his seat, his body trembling from the toll the battle had taken. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but something inside him burned brighter than ever before. They had broken the chains of the Zorath Empire, but the fight was far from over. The universe was vast, and there were still countless worlds that needed to be freed. Humanity had only just begun to rise. And no matter what, Jacob knew one thing for certain: they would never go back into the shadows again.